Hello, everybody. So first off, I'd like to say I'm absolutely humbled to be in a room with such inspirational people. Also, I have a presentation, PowerPoint. Okay, yeah, thanks. So like you were saying, I'm a third-year student reading biochemistry at Oxford in the UK. I live in the UK, I'm from there. So I welcome this opportunity to speak to the conference about my experiences during the summer when I travelled to Albania on my own on behalf of RENATE, who are a European religious network, there's a few of us in here, that is committed to combating human trafficking and exploitation. And they're represented in 19 different countries. So my reasons for going to Albania were twofold: to learn more about human trafficking, its root causes and consequences, specifically to Albania, and to learn what is being done to tackle the issue. I then turned these experiences into a report for RENATE, for their members and for their funding bodies. And something that Mariana said earlier, I'm at the very start of the journey in anti-trafficking, and when I went to Albania, I was absolutely overwhelmed with what I saw, and I kind of almost lost hope for the situation. But being in this room and seeing what is being done, it's really filled me with hope, and I think that's very important. So what did I do? I interviewed charity and social workers, police and government officials, members of RENATE, and some of those at risk in the community. First off, I want to point out, because maybe not so many people have been to Albania, that it's actually one of the most beautiful countries I've ever been to. Its people are just so generous. If it's going to work, here's a bit of footage that I took of some of the beautiful places. So there was also extreme poverty, as you can see. There was a lot of discrimination, and I even felt corruption while I was out there. It was quite obvious. So Albania is largely unspoiled. It has significant natural resources such as reserves of oil and gas, fertile land, and a developing tourism industry. But despite these apparent advantages, Albania is one of the poorest countries in Europe, and many of its citizens exist in profound poverty and deprivation. The most vulnerable members of this society are created through prejudice, lack of access to education, poverty, institutionalized corruption, and poor enforcement of the law. Many groups, they have a hopeless attitude, and they're simply just fed up with their situation. The rise of organized crime and the endless demand for prostitutes abroad have led to Albania becoming one of the most important sources of humans for trafficking in the international slave trade. So to combat this, I believe we need to strengthen the following fundamentals of any society if there is to be any hope of eradicating human trafficking in Albania. So we have education, law enforcement, equality, networks, and security. An effective framework to promote these building blocks simply does not exist today in Albania. And in this talk, I want to focus on three of these key areas, so equality, security, and networks. So I believe that promoting equality will reduce the human trafficking amongst youth, particularly in Albania. So let me take the Roma community as an example. In Tirana, the capital, I witnessed an extreme form of discrimination. So as a Roma, you are often not regarded as a citizen by the state. You find it difficult to become formally registered, and as a result, you have no right to vote, you have no formal access to healthcare or education, and you receive very little support from the government. The Roma live in appalling conditions in makeshift camps at the edge of the city with no running water or electricity. Here's some of the camps on the outside of Tirana, the capital, and it's also very shocking to see how close they are to the built-up areas. So this group, because of their poverty and their situation, they're very vulnerable to trafficking in Albania. A social worker that I met, she told me that a few years back, there was a brutal attack on one of the largest camps situated in Tirana. The shacks were burnt down, many women were injured, and hundreds of families were forced out onto the street. This spelt a small-scale humanitarian disaster for Tirana. So when the Roma community sought help from the police, so that what we were talking about, the police being involved, they were simply ignored, and the police refused to take statements from the Roma people. There was even suspicion of state involvement, as the Roma land was quickly cleared to make way for new apartment blocks. So fortunately, in this case, the NGOs fought relentlessly on behalf of the Roma people, and they helped secure convictions. So here's a picture of Roma life. It is extremely difficult to enter the formal work market. You are regarded as wild and on the very edge of society. Many find their only income through collecting rubbish. A kilogram of cans will earn you just 10 cents. Many others who cannot do this work are forced to beg. Some children, some as young as 6 months old, are being used to beg on the streets. Internal trafficking is rife in these communities. If someone said to you, "Let me give your child work, I will give you money and I will give them prospects," many of us here, if hungry, desperate, knee-deep in rubbish, would find it difficult to say no. We must provide these parents with an alternative to selling their own children into trafficking. The prejudice does not stop at this group in Albania. Women in Albania are not valued. For many women, the following is their reality. You will receive 35% less pay than a man with the same qualifications for the same job. Girls are regarded as a burden. 60% of abortions are gender selective, and this is particularly the case in rural areas. You are confined to the house for domestic duty. You are pressured to leave school early and often compelled to marry at a very young age, this particularly being the case in Roma communities. Your life is governed by men, and you are often abused and beaten by those in your own family. A Roma woman is even worse off. She has no job prospects, and it's not unusual for her to have 6 or more children that she must care for. Domestic violence is very common. With no real independence, women in Albania are so vulnerable to trafficking, especially young women who still have hope to live a better life. Such young women are easily manipulated by traffickers with false promises of jobs or love. Attitudes need to change, if not, the cycle will simply continue. So Albania must invest more in education to help bring about equality. Without education, attitudes will not change. Albania cannot expect to become a member of the European community if it does not address the issue of inequality within its society first. So among my visits, one Roma family in particular sticks in my memory. They were a very large family living in about 2 rooms in an abandoned half-built building. The mother, she was very beautiful, she was shy. She was also about the same age as me, she had about 6 kids. So when we asked her how they were doing, the family, she told us that everything was okay. Afterwards, I was told by the social workers that I was with that she'd actually been subject to her husband's violent abuse for many years. In the past, she'd reached out for help. She was desperate to leave the situation, but now she had simply given up hope. How could she survive on her own? She would receive no help from the state, and she could not support her own children. It was incredibly harrowing to meet such a woman, to meet women who had lost hope. So by investing in education and increasing equal opportunity, we can empower these girls and not make them easy prey. With awareness and equality, we should reduce the demand. So the second factor that I'd like to talk to you about today is security. So what do I mean when I say we need to increase security to decrease trafficking? So when I was in Albania, I found out that there was widespread corruption, there was poor implementation of the law, there is a slow first response from the police, there is inadequate prosecution of traffickers, there is a lack of a victim-centered approach, and there are hindering attitudes towards trafficked women. Many citizens simply don't understand that they didn't choose to be a prostitute. The president of RENATE explained to me that corruption has become so embedded in daily life in Albania that few people recognize it in its true form anymore. The norm is having to bribe your doctor or pay your teachers for essential services. This deep-rooted corruption is by far the largest challenge faced by anti-trafficking efforts. It will take a generation or more before ingrained attitudes can change. A generation has already been spent since the fall of communism in Albania, and action must be taken now. Albania's laws, I've been told by the lawyers out there, they are actually very good on paper. Lack of implementation is the real problem in Albania. For example, it is now actually illegal to use a prostitute in Albania, but this law is not enforced at all, and the police, the judges, the citizens don't know about this change. So the last factor I want to talk about today is developing networks. NGOs are working to help the vulnerable in Albania, and they are doing excellent work. However, they do not always have a good relationship with government ministries, as they constantly have to challenge local authorities to enforce their own rules and regulations. This is often due to a lack of cooperation between various internal ministries. To strengthen our networks, we need to increase effective communication and collaboration between anti-trafficking groups, such as the European governments, educators, charities, NGOs, religious institutes, and expertise from commercial entities, for example, exploiting the global outreach of mobile operators. Communication between state departments is lacking. Cross-border connections need to be improved. We must be able to match the dexterity of trafficking networks. And this is where RENATE can help. They're the network of religious in 19 different countries, and this is where we can help as well if we all connect. I've learned that also religious groups provide a silent but deadly network against human trafficking, particularly in Albania. So what are some of my solutions to the problem of trafficking in Albania? So the government has the power to implement initiatives that can make a very real difference. In the longer term, equality through education and the empowerment of women will help. This can only succeed if the Albanian government makes it a priority. This must come from the top down. Discrimination must be eradicated. Everyone must be recognized as having equal rights, regardless of ethnicity or gender. In practical terms, this means equal access to formal education, employment, housing, and healthcare. There must be more awareness of the trafficking issue, particularly taking advantage of social and media networks to publicize awareness. Another thing that I found out in Albania is that the traffickers are starting to use Facebook to gain relationships with the women, so we can also exploit these means. We must create a community that recognizes the signs of trafficking and exploitation to increase the identification of victims. We must protect our victims and support them in their rehabilitation without prejudice. I know that this is particularly a problem in Albania, where the families will reject the children if they've been caught up in it, or the communities won't want anything to do with the victims. Attitudes to corruption need to change, and organized crime must be tackled. Human trafficking is a problem created by people. It can only be eliminated by our efforts. Love will overcome greed, but only if there is a coordinated effort to combat the root causes. Existing laws and human rights must be enforced. We must not turn a blind eye to trafficking and exploitation in our own countries. Powerful security and collaborative networks must be put in place to create a framework for justice. Human trafficking is a global problem. It needs global solutions, but I believe that the cumulative effect of modest initiatives taken locally can go a long way towards combating this evil. Through increasing security, networks, and equality, I believe we can work to achieve this. Thank you for listening to me. I'm happy to take questions.